Hey there! This is going to be a detailed video about the autofocus performance of the Blackmagic Cinema Camera 6K full frame. And if you're unaware of this, Blackmagic came out with a new firmware earlier this year, right before NAB in April of 2025, that included continuous phase detect autofocus on the Blackmagic Cinema Camera 6K full frame. This is the first time we've seen continuous autofocus on a Blackmagic camera. Now I'm currently shooting on the 6K full frame with the Lumix 24-105. And I have the autofocus enabled so you can see how that's working. Now, I've seen a few videos online after this came out, testing one or two lenses, but I wanted to make a more exhaustive video with a lot of different lenses. So in this video, I'm going to test out 6 different lenses. Most of them are L-mount, a few adapted lenses, also a teleconverter. And so huge thanks to B&H Photo who lent me a bunch of these lenses to make this video. Of course, I don't own all these lenses. So if you're looking to pick up some camera gear, go check out B&H. There are links in the description for all this gear and all the gear they use on a regular basis. Also, big thanks to Blackmagic for sending out this camera for testing. Now, like I said, I will be talking about all those different lenses and how they perform in the different modes. But first, I want to show you how the different autofocus modes work and which ones are available and that sort of stuff. And I did get to test these out recently on a trip to Florida, so my buddy Jeff was helping me out. So we'll get onto the tests in a few minutes, but first, let me show you exactly the modes that are available and how to operate them. First of all, if we come into the menu and we go to the setup page, the first thing I just want to mention here is that I'm using firmware 9.5.2, so that is the current firmware that I'm on right now, and this is the beta autofocus. So if we come over to the second page, we have the autofocus type. You see beta, there's contrast-based. We want PDF phase detect autofocus. Now, there are a few ways of accessing the autofocus. First of which is you can touch the overlay button up here, and you can see that there are different overlays here, but the first one is the autofocus. You can use single AFS, that's the sort of how it used to work, where you just touch the screen and you get just the one-time focus, not continuous autofocus. Then we have AFC, continuous autofocus, and I'll show you some of these. We have object tracking and we have face detect tracking. So I can turn this off, but what I can also do is, if you don't want to access it there, if you just swipe to the right, you can see that the different autofocus modes show up over there. So let's go through these quickly. So AFS is single point focus. So you just touch what you want and it focuses it once and it doesn't continuously autofocus. So if I could touch on the laptop, I could touch on the TV, you could see that it focuses one time and it just stays locked. Then we have autofocus continuous. Autofocus continuous you can pick a point and it will just focus constantly what is in that section. So I could put on Jeff's face right here. As Jeff moves in and out, you can see it should focus as Jeff moves in and out, but it's not tracking, it's just focusing what's in that box. Then we have object tracking. So for this, I'm going to click on the laptop here, and if Jeff moves the laptop, you can see that it tracks. So it's tracking it and it's focusing it at the same time. Now that's for tracking an object. And then the last one here is the face autofocus. And this one is probably the most interesting for people. And generally, you can see right now that it's showing up in blue. Generally, when it hasn't registered a face, it will show up in white, and then you have to click on the person and it will select them. So if right here you see blue, blue indicates that it is tracking him and it's in focus. Now, as Jeff moves around a little bit, you might see that it'll pop in yellow a little bit. And so that's what it's showing, is that when it's yellow, it's not currently in focus, but it's looking to grab focus. Now, if it is red, just stand up for a second, Jeff. See, it'll lose Jeff's face there and it turns red. And so that's when it can't find the subject. And if it shows white, sometimes you have to click on the person to start focusing. It'll show that it's tracking. There's also this little number 1 here, and that's subject 1. So if another person comes in frame, it'll probably register them as person 2. So those are the different autofocus modes and how to use them. Starting out with the face tracking autofocus, on the left you have the image out of the camera, on the right I recorded the back of the screen so you could see the autofocus box and how it performs. First lens here is the Leica SL2490. This is a L-mount lens. Next up we have the Lumix 24-105 f4. This one performed the best in my opinion out of the group. Now they were all shot at 50 millimeters plus or minus depending on the lens, and at f4. As you're watching these tests, you definitely want to take a look at the way it holds focus and how much it pulses and how it tracks and all that kind of stuff. And go back and rewatch this if you'd like to see some more details. This is the Sigma Art 24-70 2.8 Mark II. And the first adapted lens is the Canon EF 24-105 f4 Mark II with the Sigma MC21. You can see here that it tracks Jeff's face. You can see the yellow box, but it does not autofocus. So tracking works well, but autofocus does not. And then I wanted to test out a Sigma EF lens. This is the Sigma Art 24-35 f2 with the MC21 adapter. Performs very similarly here to the Canon lens. You know, it tracks really well, but doesn't focus. Jeff is looking slightly in focus here because that's where he started, but it hasn't moved focus since he started moving. Next is the Lumix 70-200 f4. This is at 70 millimeters because we can't shoot it at 50. And I think this lens performs pretty well considering. Autofocus performance looks pretty similar to the other Lumix lens, the 24-105. Then I use the 2x Lumix teleconverter on the 70-200, so this would be at 140 or 70 times 2. And here's the autofocus performance. Not too bad. Next up is the tracking autofocus. This is for subject tracking. So we have Sonic here, starting out with the Leica SL 24-90, the Lumix 24-105. See, this tracks and autofocuses pretty well. The Sigma Art 24-70. Not quite as good as the Lumix. Now we have the adapted lenses, like we had before. These do not work with autofocus, but still tracks pretty well. And the Sigma EF that's adapted, very similar to the Canon. Next up we have the Lumix 70-200 f4. I think this does pretty well. Again, performs similarly to the 24-105. I didn't test that with the teleconverter. Okay, so next up we have the Spot autofocus continuous. So the focus box is just in the middle as I move my hand in and out. This is the Lumix 24-105. So it should be jumping focus between my hand and Jeff's face. The Sigma. You can see it's hunting and pulsing a little bit more than the Lumix. Adapted lenses, well, you know how this is going to go, but I had to test it and show you guys. This is the Canon EF 24-105, the Sigma Art 24-35. So adapted lenses really just do not work with autofocus. Next up was the 70-200 f4, and for whatever reason this was yelling at me and saying it was too close focus, but it worked fine at this distance in the previous test, so I'm not really sure what was going on here. So I wanted to give you a lot of examples so you could see how the camera's autofocus performs with different lenses in the different autofocus modes. As you saw, mixed results. I think in general, the Lumix lenses did better than the Sigma lens, and the adapted lenses just straight up did not work. And actually Blackmagic told me this. They said adapted lenses won't work. You need to use an L-mount lens. But I know a lot of Blackmagic users out there, including myself, were using adapted lenses, specifically a lot of EF glass. I think that's going to be pretty common. With the MC21 adapter, it is made by Sigma. In the past, using those Sigma lens adapters like the MC11 that goes from EF to E, like used on a Sony camera, I noticed that the Sigma branded EF lenses will work a little better than the Canon branded EF lenses, so I wanted to check that out here. Of course, the MC21 goes from EF to L. This is an L mount camera, but neither worked at all in terms of autofocus with the Sigma or the Canon EF lenses with the MC21 adapter. So keeping in mind this is the first generation of autofocus for Blackmagic, I think we're all rooting for them to get better with this, and I know they will over time, both in terms of the stickiness of the autofocus, the smoothness of it, and how well it actually performs the autofocus and how accurate it is. In addition to just better performance all around, I would like to see some settings to adjust the autofocus a bit, like we have in other mirrorless and some cinema cameras, like being able to adjust the speed, the sensitivity, etc. I think that'd be really cool. So would I use this for professional work? At the moment, probably not. But that's because, you know, for me personally, I know if I'm using a Blackmagic camera, I know that I'm going to have to pull focus on it manually. Now, in the least demanding situation, you know, those tests I showed you were pretty stressed. Those are stress tests, or moving the objects and subjects around quite a bit. But just standing there for a static shot, what I found was the Lumix lens worked pretty well. You know, even the beginning opening shot on this, like I was using the Lumix 24-105 and using autofocus, I did shoot that with the Sigma lens and it was hunting and pulsing a little bit. So I decided to use the Lumix lens. Like I said, I think the Lumix lenses work a little bit better than the Sigma lenses. You know, for me, testing this out, I know this is a very small sample size. Yes, there's 6 lenses, but I didn't test every Lumix lens and every Sigma L-mount lens out there. But from this small sample size, it looks like the 2 Lumix lenses perform better than the Sigma lens. And these are all current L-mount lenses. The Sigma Art 24-70 is the Mark II version. So I think this is a great start from Blackmagic, but there's definitely some work to be done. And I know this is kind of in the beta stage and this is the first attempt at it. So a couple more questions you might have to ask, you might be asking about using the autofocus is, how about filming yourself? Well, you know, most people are not buying this camera to film themselves or for content creation, but because of the price point and the image quality, and maybe you already have this camera for something else, maybe you do want to film yourself for something, what's that like? Well, I think at the moment it's a little bit tricky just because of the way that the interface and the algorithm works. A lot of times, like I said earlier, when you are using face detect, it will show a white box around the person, and you actually have to touch the screen for it to start focusing. So it'll track when it's white, but it won't start focusing until it turns blue. And the way you get that started is by touching the screen. Well, of course, if you're filming yourself, it's really hard to touch the screen. And if you go to the back to touch the screen, then you're not in front of the camera. You guys see what's going on here. Also, if you are using an HDMI monitor, the autofocus box and information will not go out over HDMI. Maybe there's a way to turn it on, but I couldn't find it in there. That would be really helpful to see if the autofocus is working or not. Of course, you can't touch your HDMI monitor for touch focus, but if like you're filming yourself or at a different angle or something like that, you could see if it's working or not. The next thing I wanted to briefly mention was wildlife. There's probably not that many people out there that are using these cameras for wildlife, but I do like filming wildlife. And you know, there are only 3 continuous autofocus modes on the 6K full frame, which I showed you. There's no animal tracking, but I will talk about that more in an upcoming video about shooting wildlife on the 6K full frame, because I spent a full day with a lot of shooting and I got a lot of really cool shots of wildlife stuff on this camera. So look for that video coming up. Anyways, if you enjoyed this video, please consider hitting subscribe. Otherwise, thanks for watching and we'll see you in the next one.